Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to see you here this morning and to see our panel here in a wonderful day for the Festival of Ideas, a day where we're looking at the significance of history and how the influence of the past have shaped Australian society. I can see some people here who were present last night when we heard a fabulous and wide-ranging lecture about nations and nationalism from Professor David Cannadine. And I just want to remind you that at 1:30 today we'll be presenting here at the Festival of Ideas Professor Linda Colley, speaking about nations and constitutions. And so I do urge those who are interested in the big questions of what makes a nation to attend that. My name's Kate Derrian-Smith. I'm the professor here at the University of Melbourne in Australian History and Australian Studies, and a lot of my interests revolve around the ways in which Australians imagine their society and interact with their society and think about their nation, and certainly questions of national identity. And it's often said that Australians have a very particular obsession with national identity, and I hope today that we'll explore some of those reasons why, what that identity might be, and look at the influences on the shaping of nationhood and senses of belonging in Australia. Well, what we'll do this morning is we have four very distinguished speakers who are going to address, they were given a very, very broad topic, Australian history and the Australian presence, influences of the 19th century. That's very big, but they've managed to distill that down into, I hope, into some key themes. And we'll be moving through our four speakers. I'll give brief introductions. They'll speak for about 15 minutes. I have been told I have to tap them on the shoulder if they go on too long, but I'm sure they won't do that. And then at the end, there'll be plenty of time for discussion as we try and pull many of the points that are raised together. So we'll move, I think, straight into the really important part of today, which is hearing from the speakers. And I would like to introduce, first up to the podium, Jim Davison, who's the Principal Research Fellow at the Australian Centre here at the University of Melbourne, and is a very noted historian and senior historian who has worked in many aspects of Australian identity, including tourism, cultural history, and more recently in a very acclaimed biography of the historian Sir Keith Hancock called A Three-Cornered Life. Jim is going to discuss here three iconic visions or imaginations or responses to Australia from the 19th century. Anthony Trollope's 1873 travel text, Australia and New Zealand, Hancock's book Australia, published in 1930, and a much later book, Donald Horne's iconic 1964 work, The Lucky Country, to trace I suppose the images and the visions of Australia in those writings. So I welcome you, Jim, up to the podium.
Thank you very much. We are concerned today with questions of identity, and this paper really straddles both sessions. Why, we might ask, have Australians been so preoccupied with identity? You didn't hear of it in connection with the United Kingdom, that is, until it began to show signs of dissolving. The same is true of New Zealand. Theirs is the double identity of Maori and Pākehā, and the challenge is to modulate that. Australia, though, for a long time was more completely British, and never had, as America did, a defining moment of rupture from the mother country. Independence was acquired in instalments. Gradualism meant that little changed dramatically. So the talk has always been of identity or citizenship, rarely the hard edge of nationality. Moreover, the sharing of language and culture with an Anglosphere has always made our borders more porous. And that's now compounded by a second factor. As our society has become more open to globalisation, not least culturally, we've reached the point where advocacy of Australian cultural content can seem provincial or daggy. So as a kind of preliminary to our discussion of identity, I want to talk about three famous accounts of Australia and show how their perspectives and understanding of Australia shifts. And I'll repeat them again because will help you to remember them. The first is by the English novelist Anthony Trollope, 1873. The second, the Australian-born W.K. Hancock's book Australia of 1930. And the last, Donald Horne's The Lucky Country of 1964. Anthony Trollope was already a famous Victorian novelist, as he remains, when he spent a year here in the 1870s, touring. Trollope was well placed to write an account of Australia and New Zealand, to give the books, the two massive volumes, their full title, since he had already visited other colonies and written about them. Moreover, while at home among the gentry, he had lived for 15 years in Ireland, and once remarked that whenever he heard an Irish voice, he felt a sudden rush of affinity. So he was not wedded to establishment nostrums, instead priding himself on getting to the heart of the matter, as he had done when a travelling postal inspector. Trollope toured the Australian colonies more thoroughly than any other traveller to that time. He went down mines unenthusiastically, stayed on country properties, and visited at least one Aboriginal mission. In Tasmania, he nearly got stuck in a cave. A nice image, a portly Victorian gentleman stuck, legs flailing. But he was perceptive. Trollope visited Port Arthur, still a convict establishment, and prophesied that one day tourists would visit its curious ruins. Much of the book is repetitious. It was written on the run, in sections. But partly this was a direct consequence of how he found Australia, then 6 isolated colonies, best reached from each other by sea. There was not even a customs union between them, an absurdity, as Trollope pointed out, since tariff duties held back all sorts of industries by walling off their natural markets. One day there should be federation, he believed, but that was a long way off yet. And only then, in the fullness of time, might separation from Britain be considered. In the meantime, he was struck by the almost violent loyalty the colonists had for the old country. Trollope was unusually aware that this was a new country, where things would be done differently, sometimes for good local reasons. This flexibility accounts for the fact that, while he was most comfortable with the squatters, whom he saw as a colonial gentry, he also saw that, unlike the great landowners of England, they were an aristocracy of yesterday. Their moral claim to extensive ownership was weak. The colonial governments were opening up the land to smallholders, and Trollope was on their side. "I love a squatter," he declared, "but on principle I love a free selector." It was very simple. The colonies existed so that Englishmen and women could live better lives of regrettable necessity outside England. The small number of squatters should not be allowed to stand in the way of the new country's capacity to accommodate them. While Trollope had come to Australia basically to see his son, a squatter, quite early he had decided that the book he wrote would function as an emigrant's guide. Throughout the work he gives lists of expenses. Mutton, 4p a pound, beef 6p, tea 2 shillings. For he believed that every working man who was able should make the journey, since the benefit was so plain. And while he despaired of young English gentlemen who had gone forth and, being drifters, had gradually fallen further than they would have done at home, Trollope repeatedly praised the bearing of ordinary people in Australia, such as miners. "The best of our workmen go from us," he wrote, "and produce a race superior to themselves." Trollope's generous attitude on these matters, unfortunately, was not without a cost borne by the Aborigines. While aware of the brutalities and injustices inflicted on the poor blacks, they scarcely troubled him. The British Empire was advancing on the full tide of Western industrial civilization, which it had initiated. And to anyone surfing that, the fate of any people that stood in the way was clear. They had to bow to necessity. So Trollope disparaged missions, cant, and wrote of the Aborigines, by the time he reached Western Australia, "Their doom is to be exterminated, and the sooner that their doom be accomplished, so that there be no cruelty, the better it will be for civilization." Chilling. Writing nearly 60 years later, W.K. Hancock entitled his opening chapter, "The Invasion of Australia." He was the first to describe the white occupation of the continent this way, addressing the whole ecological onslaught: men, machinery, rabbits, blackberries, denuded hills and muddied streams. What had happened to the Aborigines was a subset of this despoliation. "White Australia," Hancock wrote, "sheds over their predestined passing an economical tear." What concerned Hancock most, writing on the eve of the Great Depression, was that Australia seemed to have run out of energy. White settlement had rushed onwards like the scattering of a horde, applying a civilization ready-made. But it seemed to have lost its impetus. The whole country, he believed, had become a sheltered workshop. Australians were addicted to protection, excluding competitive goods with high tariffs. They were too much in love with the very word itself, extending it to the expectation that Britain would, in the end, always come to their rescue. More immediately, protection legitimated the fact that half of all government revenues came from customs duties. Behind this wall, there had grown up a fantasy land, with wages kept high and industries feather-bedded by subsidies. At the same time, Australian governments had borrowed massively. The developmentalist dream meant that railway projects accounted for fully half the public debt of the states. Hancock felt it could not go on. The Depression put an end to it soon enough. So Hancock questioned arbitration, the basic wage, and the way the stated goal of the fair and reasonable seemed so often to abet the middling standard, a concept he had taken from de Tocqueville, writing on America, and saw reaffirmed in most things about him in Australia. The Conservatives he identified as the parties of resistance, with Labor traditionally as the party of initiative. But Hancock was unimpressed by the way Labor's commonplace cliques were competing with each other to manipulate the machine. He speaks, of course, only of the 1930s. In the end, Australia's achievements were largely illusory, or at least untested. It had been sheltered from other nations and sustained only a handful of people in relation to its resources, points by no means obsolete today. Hancock, the returnee Rhodes Scholar, had the perspective of both an outsider and an insider. Today, he would be denounced as an elite, out of touch with mainstream Australia. To some extent he was, but there was a sense in which his personal position matched Australia's then as a dominion in the British Empire. Hancock did not use the word identity, but a sense of it is inherent in the book. Increasingly, Australia would become British with a small b, as he later put it, and perhaps eventually something more. He was well aware of where Australia stood in the world, and the last cryptic sentences in the book point to an awakening Asia. Hancock's Australia was immensely influential until the 1960s. Indeed, it lingered on beyond its time, thanks to the perceptiveness of its analysis and the brilliance of its aphorisms. But in 1964, it was knocked off the perch by Donald Horne's The Lucky Country. Trollope had seen Australia as a vacant piece of real estate, while for Hancock it was an ingrown British dominion. Horne took a much more radical approach. Peopled from all over Asia is the title of the section, full of random impressions, that opens the book. Australia had to bring itself into focus, not least in relation to the region. Famously, one way of doing this, Horne believed, would be to cut the apron strings and declare ourselves a republic. This was the first time the idea entered the mainstream in 20th century Australia, calmly integrated in the course of a general account of the country. Rereading the book nearly 50 years after it first appeared, one is struck by how restrictive the political and social climate then was. For someone still nominally a liberal, Horne finds remarkably little to say in favour of Sir Robert Menzies. Australia was still too firmly in the grip of the past, Hancock's stagnation. Elites were still too Anglophile, foreign policy derivative, the White Australia policy still upheld, although with less and less enthusiasm. A rigid censorship kept out fresh ideas and insights. Unequal pay for women was the generally accepted norm. Civil rights for Aborigines had only just started to be won. So Horne's book is in part a manifesto. He had the strong belief that if there were not change, Australia, in its present form, may cease to exist. The people, for all the qualities that Horne genuinely admires, have been spoilt by success. They had it too easy. Horne rails against the fair go, as Hancock did against protection. Hence the intended sting in the title, The Lucky Country, which of course was quickly turned round and read as endorsement. Repeatedly, Horne remarks that public life in this country is stunningly bad. In the most quoted sentence of the book, he wrote that Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. Ordinary people were right to be sceptical of the political class. It didn't deserve respect. The country was ripe for change, and Horne detected a rebelliousness in the coming generation, the boomers, who might be the ones who could achieve it. Without realising it, that would come later, Horne was acting as John the Baptist for Gough Whitlam. The Lucky Country is a good and vigorous polemic, but despite the stabs of recognition, its time has passed. We're more than due for another major account to take its place in the line. And who would best write it? Anybody could try their hand. But the centre of gravity has so shifted that today it would be more likely to be written by a woman and or someone from one of the multicultural communities. It would run the risk of being, of necessity, more sectional. But then the sense of identity in contemporary Australia has itself become more diffuse. Later in the day and the week, various issues will be addressed. But the crystallisation provided by each of our three became a marker in the development of an Australian identity. Each of them was concerned, in their own way, to get it right, as indeed must we. In an age of globalisation, when, falsely, national identity may seem less necessary, and in the face of a more than emergent Asia, with whom our dealings will become increasingly intricate and urgent.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think that reflecting on those three texts really sets up our discussion for the whole of today, not just this afternoon, not just this morning, but also into the afternoon. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Beverley Kingston, who is a writer and historian who's worked at the University of New South Wales for 30 years. But for me, she wrote a work in the 1970s that was very influential. My wife, my daughter and Poor Mary Ann, which was a very early study of women in Australia. And I think when I was studying as a student, I found it opened up a new way of perceiving Australia. She's had a very long association with the Australian Dictionary of Biography in New South Wales and now serves on the board of the AGB, and has written some very key works. One of those is Volume 3 of the Oxford History of Australia. The title of that volume is Glad Confident Morning, and that looks at the second half of the 19th century. And she's also written for Cambridge University Press a history of New South Wales. Her most recent work looks at Pearl Beach and the Progress Association. So she's gone from national to state to a local community to trace many ideas of belonging, place and I suppose the environment. And this morning, Beverly's going to talk to us about some of the major influences from the 19th century on how we view Australia, the environment, both natural and built, and the ways that space is organised, and also some of the ideas from the 19th century that continue to influence us today through political, economic and religious institutions. So let's see if she can do it in that short period of time, and I'll welcome you to the stage.
Thanks, Kate. Well, I'm not going to talk very much about the obvious visible impact of the 19th century through the environment. I'll just ask you to think for a moment about how we are still today using roads, bridges, street patterns in our cities, 19th century buildings in public sense and in many cases as private houses that were built, that were constructed and laid down in the 19th century. And there's no doubt in my mind that in some respects these material patterns still influence the way we think and do things. You've only got to think for a moment about renovating a 19th century house to make it livable for the 21st century. Or think about the way in which 19th courtrooms built in the 19th century are so different now from courtrooms that have been built in the 21st century. So we are, in many ways, we are still living with the 19th century. Now, before I go on, I'll just say that this is an experience which has become increasingly important in a way for Australians. The 19th century Australians were building modern buildings and roads and bridges in ways they needed them. And they could be and were unaffected, as it were, by the past. It's probably one of the very significant things about 19th century Australia, that it was such a new place, whereas we are gradually accumulating a sense of past and tradition, which is quite interestingly now beginning to intersect with the different kind of society, demography we have now. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. In addition to the physical structure of the 19th century that we still have, we've got an immense legacy of ideas which we hold both collectively and individually, I think, from the 19th century. And I'll just say a little bit about the two sets of ideas. It struck me last night listening to David Cannadine that he was talking almost entirely about collective ideas, whereas I think there's a very complicated and interesting problem about individually held ideas which only vaguely relate to what we historians generally interpret as collective ideas. Now, just think of this for a minute. Australia was founded, the Australian colonies were all established during the early part of the 19th century. During those years, many of the ideas which we now have deeply embedded in our political and other consciousness were in fact being created. Now, I'm not talking about the big ones like out of religion and sort of the big politics, but I'm talking about the writings of people like Adam Smith, Malthus, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, who all wrote their big books during the first half of the 19th century, more or less, give or take a few years. Now, ideas that were set out there, like ideas between relations between capital and labour, ideas about evolution, have since not only been incorporated into our ordinary daily thought, but they've also become ways in which we organise our society. And indeed, I often wonder whether they haven't become self-fulfilling. I mean, there seems to be nothing really absolutely fixed. When some of these ideas were first written, they were theoretical, not real. And I sometimes wonder whether the theory was convincing enough to be made real by people's subsequent behaviour. Ideas like ideas about the market became self-evident once they were articulated in Australia and elsewhere around the world. And I think, in a way, this is the beginning of globalisation, not now, but when those sort of organising ideas for human society became articulated so that people could say, oh yes, that makes sense, that's what it is. In Australia, in the 19th century, ideas about the market very quickly became part of or generated the doctrine of free trade, which was especially important in New South Wales, which thrived on producing resources for Britain and was nothing really much more than a place to be exploited and a place where people could exploit and make money out of exploiting it. By contrast, John Stuart Mill's ideas about liberty, liberalism, the liberty of the individual in society, came to Australia, came more later, and came more with the free immigrants who came during the gold rushes. They became more important in Victoria and eventually were translated in Australia more quickly than in other places because of the freedom of movement and so on, into one man, one vote, and after that, very quickly, one woman, one vote. One vote, one value. But they also led to ideas about the development of protection. Protection of, Mill was very strong on the protection of the weak individual, the protection of weak industries, the protection of weak workers. And these ideas of protection became particularly important in Victoria, which didn't have, once the gold rushes were over, the sorts of exportable resources that New South Wales and the great hinterland further to the north and west had. And so by the end of the 19th century in Australia, the two big colonies were quite different in their view of the relative importance of market values on the one hand and protection of industry and individuals on the other. This division between the protection and free trade, as you probably know, was one of the fundamental problems to be overcome with federation, and it was one of the dominant problems for the early years of the federal parliament. It's still a problem, although nobody tends to discuss it in those terms today. But I think every time I hear Malcolm Fraser articulating some extreme, what he calls real liberal view about, particularly about the rights of individuals and the position of refugees and so on, I think of that. I think of the contrast between Fraser and Howard, who are, in my view, archetypal representatives of protection on the one hand and free trade on the other. And indeed, I'd even go further, and I have gone further, as to say that in New South Wales, in the last 20 or 30 years, the revival of old, almost pure Adam Smith values is really quite frightening, coming not only from the Liberal Party, but also these almost 18th century values actually are espoused by the Labor movement. That's another story, and I haven't got time to deal with it today. Of those big 19th century, of those interesting 19th century theories that we have inherited and carry on, one of the more interesting ones, thinking on a long historical framework, is what has happened to ideas about population. As Jim said, talking about Trollope articulated that sense of Australia as a great space just ready for settlement and exploitation. It became a kind of the spread of people from Britain in particular into Australia during the 19th century was enormous. And by the end of the 19th century, one of the things that people were sort of so proud of was how much of Australia had been productively settled, made use of, in comparison with the dreadful unproductiveness that had existed hitherto when it was just the hunting ground for a few native Aborigines. However, by the end of the 19th century too, there were people in Australia who were beginning to sense that there was something wrong with this endless spread of the population, and quite famously and worryingly for government, the birth rate began to decline, so much so that a Royal Commission of Inquiry was held into the decline of the birth rate in Australia in New South Wales in 1904. What was happening partly was a natural response to the affluence that had developed out of conditions in Australia, but also I think what was happening was something that needed to happen on a world scale. The human race can't keep on reproducing endlessly so that it overruns the planet like mice or locusts, and it has to. Throughout the whole of the 20th century, we've had this ongoing debate about reproduction and the growth of populations on an Australian scale, on a world scale. We've had the debates about how as countries industrialise and become prosperous, their populations expand, as the population of England expanded during the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th century. But there's nowhere for people to go any longer, and one of the reasons for all the refugees around the world is that, you know, there aren't places where people can go now to have good standards of living, good lives, and you know, we are frankly running out of places in the world to colonise. And talking about the moon or Mars is just nonsense. What interests me about all of this is looking at it, how long it has taken for our ideas about multiplying population and the position of the human species in the order of things on a global scale to be taken seriously. And it's a long way to go before we actually do anything effective. No, that's not true. We have been doing things that are effective, but not effective enough. But anything to actually pull back the threat that the human race will actually eat and drink the world to death. And this sort of leads into the whole question of climate change, doesn't it? Where that's a question which has come up. It's been on the agenda actually now for a lot of the 20th century, but no one has paid much attention to it. The evidence is very thin. The distribution of resources is very uneven around the world, and it will certainly not be in any of our lifetimes that anything much is done to change it. But if you just think of the time that it takes for ideas to move into human consciousness and then to be acted upon and proliferate and become widely accepted. If you look at the example of what has happened to population in Australia, where we're still being told we don't reproduce enough, and this is also nonsense, that's a part of the manufacturer's ramp. When you think of the time it has taken, the historical perspective, looking into the future for changing big ideas like that, is very long indeed. Now, there's also the other thing that I'm very interested in is the legacy of ideas individually, for individuals. This is bound to be different in a society that stretches way back, like the old societies of Europe, to what it's been in Australia. And one of the things that has been quite interesting to me about the changing nature of Australian society with recent immigrants and the very mobile nature of Australian society is how, on the one hand, people's ideas can move very quickly. Their own personal ideas can move very quickly. But on the other hand, how they look very interestingly into their own pasts. In Australia, I think we've been seeing in the last couple of generations a kind of consolidation of historical memory, especially through the interest in family history, as people try to piece together their personal story and relate it to what they know of the national or collective story. It sometimes surfaces in interesting ways when descendants turn up to recount their little piece of the past. I had an interesting experience of this recently at a book launch in Sydney where a chap came up to me and announced that he was a grandson of Fisher, Andrew Fisher, the Prime Minister in 1914. He was a strange bloke, actually, but his whole view of the world and of his place in it was related to this important, for him, important fact. We had another sort of interesting case on the Central Coast in the last election where a chap who was a grandson, he was a grandson, a great-grandson of Sir Henry Parkes, ran as a weird independent in the elections. And he used the fact that he was a descendant of Parkes as part of his election campaign. And this happens all the time. You see letters in the paper from people sort of writing in to say that they're related to so-and-so, and they have their own little version of the story, and they want to tell you about it. Now, that is spread on a very wide scale. There are all of these people, and as Australia becomes more complicatedly multicultural, there'll be more and more stories that go back into all kinds of strange places in the world, and people who have strange experiences and strange memories and strange baggage that they bring with them. They both add up and don't add up to some notion of national identity. You can't get at that sort of huge collective experience and memory, certainly not as a historian, though you can do it to perhaps as a biographer, and you can do it perhaps sometimes working on a local scale with small communities, but not really. I'm constantly amazed at the stories that people have to tell. For a long time, for a long time there was a kind of a general thing where people used to like to try to claim a convict in their background. Or there was a time when they didn't too, but then there became a time when they became quite clear. That's sort of fallen out. It's become a bit more fashionable these days to be able to claim some Aboriginal inheritance if you can. And there's sort of a great collection of memorabilia, family records, things like that sort of they hold personally and dearly. Now, these sorts of things are not at the forefront of people's minds when they think about national identity. They tend to think about how those stories relate to the wider story, but national identity is made up of something really quite different. And I'll just say one more thing. There's also this very interesting thing about which bits of it people pick and which bits they identify with. In my own case, I've 4 grandparents, one Scottish, one Northern Ireland, one English, and the other we don't really want to know. We think it's some dreadful Irish, bad back box story. Anyhow, but the family has abandoned all of the stories except for the Scottish one. That was the one we identified with when I was growing up, and I was brought up to think of myself as Scottish. What does this mean about identity? It means a lot about, it says a lot about the past, and it says a lot about the way in which we think about the past, but I don't know what it says about national identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beverly, for, I suppose, really reminding us that the nation is made up of individuals, families, and there's a lot, I suppose it's very turbulent. I thought the point about how we define ourselves, I think many of us have grandparents from many different places, and I think that's a very interesting one that we might return to in discussion. Well, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Professor Emeritus Geoffrey Blainey, who has been writing and talking about Australian history for many, many years. is very well known in Australia as a commentator on history and had a long academic career here at the University of Melbourne, as well as being the inaugural Chancellor of the University of Ballarat and teaching Australian Studies at Harvard University. Geoffrey Blainey's book on the effect of isolation on Australia, entitled The Tyranny of Distance, really gave that term wide currency within Australia and outside Australia. And he has, as many of you will know, gone on to write numerous books. My note says 32, which I think is pretty good for your career. He's written A Short History of the World, Triumph of the Nomads, The Causes of War, and A Shorter History of Australia. So I welcome Geoffrey to the podium to talk to us about the various forms of 19th century nationalism. Thank you.
Fellow panellists, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't know where this building was, and I was walking around and I found a man with a cobber with a university motif putting a new bulb in the ceiling. He looked promising. I said to him, do you know where the Festival of Ideas is? He turned to his cobber and he said, Festival of Ideas? He said, that's a new one. But I applaud Patrick McCaughey, who's sitting in the front row. He's organised the Festival of Ideas. It's a great thing to do. Curiously, I've never been at a discussion on nationalism before. I've thought about it a lot and attended lectures on it, but it's great that there should be a discussion on a subject so important to Australian history and a topic very much alive in national debate. I was thinking a few years ago I went into a second-hand bookshop and there was a book I've not seen before and I've not seen since, but it was the account of a sheep breeder from the Western District who'd lived in Australia for most of his life and then in the early 1880s decided before he died that he wished to go back to the British Isles and see them again. He left Australia as a loyal Briton, but as his journey proceeded, he began to wonder whether he was not an Australian. He eventually concluded that he belonged to both worlds. There's a fascinating account of how he's travelling on the plains near Rome in a railway train and he looks at the black soil and he says, that would be wonderful country for selecting. Those of you who are old enough will know that the selectors were the first selectors of the land against the squatters in the 19th century. When he went to the Holy Land, he was travelling between Jericho and I think the Jordan, and he thought, this country looks familiar. He said, I like it very much. He said, it's so like the Saltbush Plains near Deniliquin in the Riverina. Finally, he was in Constantinople and it pleased him no end to see the ships in the harbour and all the activity and the minarets and the cheerful sunshine. And he said, I love this place. But after a while, he realised that he'd seen a place that was much better. He said, this reminds me very much of the approaches to Geelong. Sleepy Hollow had never had such an advocate. But I thought after reading that book, there are so many different kinds of nationalism, so many different ways in which people identified themselves in the 19th century and in the 20th century, and even today. I once tried to make a list of the kinds of nationalism that I thought flourished in Australia at one time or other, and some of them are obviously there's a kind of a nationalism place, intensely powerful, promoted very much by painters and writers, and in one sense taken over by the Greens now, but more perhaps by the light Greens than by the dark Greens. There's a strong Aboriginal nationalism that we didn't notice for a long time, but was there and has become much more prominent in the last 40 years. And there's a very prominent strand of nationalism in Australia that doesn't have a name, but I call it athletic nationalism. Australians taking extreme pride in their sporting endeavours, and this was probably the first country in the world where spectator sport got out of hand. And that athletic nationalism is linked very much to Gallipoli. After all, Gallipoli in the first months was seen as almost an athletic contest, and the First World War was probably the last time where there was any hope of war being seen as an athletic contest. But Kokoda, of course, in many ways has been taken up by the football teams, and one after another they go to Kokoda and come back feeling that there's some link between sport and Kokoda. And there's showcase nationalism, which is very prominent, and you mentioned it briefly, Beverly. There are large numbers of Australians who take intense pride in any kind of innovation that can be associated with this land, whether it's the fact that Australia was the first place in the world to give both the vote to women and the right to women to stand for Parliament, or the fact that Australia was the world's great social laboratory with New Zealand in the period 1890 to 1910. So much so that many people interested in this topic, when asked about 1910, which will be the first socialist or communist country in the world, they said Australia or New Zealand. Little did they know. And then many people, even today, display this kind of nationalism. You hear it in that complicated debate about climate change. Many people say Australia should be the first to act, it should show the world. So we have all these various kinds of nationalism. Sometimes they coalesce briefly, sometimes they fight, but they're very powerful. I'm going to speak just on two kinds of nationalism. I chose them because I thought nobody else would choose them. They're slightly boring, but I'll do my best. The first one is economic nationalism. I suspect that economic nationalism was the first kind of nationalism to become conspicuous in Australia. You know, once the various Australian colonies had their own parliaments, very soon they decided that they might or they might not impose duties on goods that came from other colonies or goods that came from overseas. I think the farmers on the Bellarine Peninsula just beyond Geelong were the first effective protectionists in Australia. They wanted an import duty on foreign wheat, the foreign wheat mostly coming from South Australia. And David Syme built up The Age, and The Age had the biggest circulation by the 1980s of any newspaper in the British Empire outside London. And he was an extreme nationalist of this kind. He believed that Victoria could only grow great if it had large-scale manufacturing industries, and those manufacturing industries could only survive if they imposed strong duties on goods that came from Europe and the United States or even from other Australian colonies. And when in 1901 the Commonwealth of Australia was created, it formed one of the largest common markets in the world, and of course very soon it was protectionist. The sugarcane industry along the Queensland coast depended heavily on protection. A few other Australian primary industries began to take to protection. Protection became so powerful, or economic nationalism, that it soon captured political parties. Two of the strongest political movements in Australia began life as free traders or anti-protectionists. The New South Wales Labor Party, which I think became the first Labor Party to succeed in 1891, and then early in the century the Country Party, now the National Party, they moved rapidly from free trade to protection. The great train thundering along was too fast and too powerful, and they had to jump aboard, leaving their old principles behind. By 1910, economic nationalism in Australia was a sentiment very powerful, and it presided with special flair over the packaging of goods. Thus, Nathan Isle of South Australia used a big label reading, "Australia, the land of promise." That's what you bought when you bought a bottle of beer in South Australia. McCracken's Bitter Ale displayed the motto, "Advance Australia." Billy Tea was a special favourite. Billy Tea in New South Wales really popularised the words of Waltzing Matilda. A great majority of Australians who knew the words of Waltzing Matilda by 1910 had learned them from Billy Tea. Billy Tea was probably more important than Henry Lawson and the Heidelberg School for a time in promoting this form of nationalism. I apologise, Patrick. Protectionism, nationalism, economic nationalism enjoyed a wonderful innings. It's still powerful, but not the same as in 1900. It has moved over mainly to the service industries which dominate the workforce. The universities are now part of economic nationalism, a proud exporter of education to Australia and a boon to the nation's economy. They want protection from the government, but they no longer apply to the long-forgotten Tariff Board. They apply to the Immigration Department or other government agencies. Economic nationalism is now more complex. The controversy about the mining tax, a controversy still with us, displays the power of economic nationalism. When Mr Rudd first announced that the mining companies of Australia must pay a larger share of their income in taxes, he appealed strongly to economic nationalism. He said the minerals, they're part of the soil, and the rocks, they're part of the heart of the nation. They belong to all Australians, everyone, now and for generations to come. Those were his sentiments. It was not noticed that the idea completely cut across the concept of native title, which he genuinely espoused. It also completely cut across the idea of federation, which when in Queensland he also espoused. At first I thought Mr Rudd and the federal government might have had some kind of victory, a quick victory in this debate. Nationalism is a powerful emotion, a very powerful argument, but I don't think he was prepared for the debate. I think his Treasury let him down very badly in that debate. His grasp of the economic facts of the day was weaker than his sense of the potential power of economic nationalism to back them. In this same debate, another kind of nationalism asserted itself, the sense of place. Thus, Western Australia and Queensland, the states richest in minerals, appealed to their own sense of nationalism. They were the heartland of Australia, they said. Surely they owned the minerals. They said or implied that if a mining tax proved to be heavy, it would represent a huge transfer of income from West Australia and Queensland to the other states and to Canberra. Regional loyalty is not the same nationalism, but it is a sister. It often asserts itself in Australia. In 1933, as some of you will remember, Western Australia tried to secede. If it had seceded, of course, after Pearl Harbor, it would have quickly rejoined the Commonwealth of Australia. The world is shrinking. We're in the midst of a new technological revolution which may prove to be as important as the Industrial Revolution. We don't know yet. Globalisation is the buzzword. It puts nationalism in a predicament, but not really. Internationalism and nationalism will keep on fighting with occasional peace treaties and even temporary mergers. I suspect, I may be wrong, that the more that the world shrinks, the more tenacious will be the sense of place, the sense of belonging to one corner of the world and honouring its symbols. But then again, I might be wrong. And have I a few minutes for just one other stern chairman? Could I just speak briefly about what I call red, white and blue nationalism? It's been very powerful in Australia. It rises and falls. It's an attempt to balance a loyalty to Britain and its institutions and to balance a pride in Australia. As time went on, there was more and more rivalry between the love of Australia and the affection for the British Isles. The spread of the word pommy, a derogatory term for an English immigrant, coined just before the First World War, was a sign of the increasing rivalry. When Prime Minister Billy Hughes busied himself at the peace conference in 1919 and had no time whatsoever for facets of British foreign policy, that was another sign of the divide. The argument generally was that Britain was the greatest empire in the world and the fountain of civilization, but there was a parallel argument. Australia, on those British foundations, had built a new and far superior edifice. Red, white and blue nationalism, the combination of Australian and British patriotism or nationalism, might have declined more rapidly but for the Boer War and the two world wars. The war strengthened the old international bonds. Since 1970, the influence of this kind of nationalism has diminished, every now and then surging forward again. Some of the reasons are self-evident. Japan was replacing Britain as the main trading partner. That happened even at the end of Sir Robert Menzies' long era. The United States replaced Britain as the main military ally. Britain joined the European community, and Britons ceased to crowd the migrant ships and the planes coming to Australia. Of course, and I must finish, the recent surge of republicanism in Australia reflects some of these underlying changes to this long-standing relationship between the two countries. Much of the opposition to republicanism today stems from the old red and white, blue nationalists. One has no idea what will happen in the next 10 years to the Republican debate, but when it arises again, this continuing phase of nationalism will be a very important part of that debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey, for touching on regionalism, which I think is something that is flowing through a lot of our discussions, as well as the nationalism and the economy. And the idea of thinking about Australia as a series of places and spaces takes us neatly into our next talk here. I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Dr. Reby Taylor, who is an Australian Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the Australian Centre here at the University of Melbourne, where she is conducting research on the history of Tasmanian Aboriginal people within the scientific imagination. Reby has written a very highly acclaimed book, Unearthed, The Aboriginal Tasmanians of Kangaroo Island, which won several prizes, the South Australian Premier's Award for Non-Fiction, the Victorian Premier's Award, and the Canberra Critics Circle Award for Literature. And she's going to talk today, and we shift a little bit, we actually shift southwards, to reflect on Australian identity in relation to Tasmania. Tasmania, of course, having a very particular place within Australia. And she wants to trace the concerns with history, landscape, and genetics, bring genetics into this discussion from the 19th century to today. So welcome, Reby.
Thank you, Kate. Tasmania, in the words of English writer Nicholas Shakespeare, is a byword for remoteness. It is like out of space on Earth, and invoked by all those at the centre to stand for all that is far-flung, strange, and unverifiable. The centre here, of course, is a byword for Europe, or perhaps more particularly, Britain. What is Tasmania to us here on mainland Australia? Not quite out of space. But as fellow panellist Jim Davidson puts it, it's always seemed a bit different. It's not merely cut off below us, a place to look down to, in more ways than one, to joke about. Tasmania's landscape seems so different to how we like to think of our red-earthed or tropical sunny Australia. An island of high latitudes, writes Jim, of mountains, lakes, mists, clouds and rain, of wastes of awesome scenery. Well, so too are several other parts, particularly of southeastern Australia. But they're not defined as Tasmania is. Tasmania is the home of the wilderness, a politicised and historicised wilderness. Tasmania renamed itself in 1856, determined in Jim's words to be born again. But the previous half-century of convicts, bushrangers and doomed Aborigines proved, as he puts it, ineradicable. This wilderness, once the unforgiving natural prison of Marcus Clarke's For the Term of His Natural Life, remains haunted by a tragic past, as any Port Arthur tour guide would attest. Henry Reynolds remembers as a university student in Tasmania talking to a history lecturer about the beauty of the state's landscape. No, he was told, it's a bloody sad place. You can still hear the Aborigines crying in the wind. Tasmanians, white Tasmanians, had been listening to this crying by then for more than a century. From the mid-19th century, decades before the death of Truganini, Tasmanian journalists and popular historians mourned the passing of the Aborigines with funereal melancholy and certain inevitability. Anthropologists, mostly British at this time, shared a sense of sadness, sometimes chastising imperialism for the loss of the Tasmanians, whom they thought were so important as representatives of the earliest stage of cultural evolution. Anthropology, as it's at this time, was, in Patrick Brantlinger's words, a science of mourning, understanding its task at salvaging from the tide of colonialism what would otherwise be irretrievably lost. And they often then re-represented these collections within a language of nostalgia and regret. What interests me is the way these 19th century expressions of regret were in some ways recycled in the late 20th century Australia. A growing sense of unease about Australia's past, underpinned by a revisionist historical project which aspired to break what W.E.H. Stanner coined as the Great Australian Silence over Australia's frontier violence, made Tasmania's Aboriginal history, I think, a focus of national shame. Think of Bernard Smith's landmark 1980 Boyer Lectures, in which he wrote of an Australia that was haunted by the spectre of Truganini. But one of the most important expressions of this shame and breaking of the silence in a popular form was Tom Hayden's successful 1978 film, The Last Tasmanian. The camera scans a beautiful Tasmanian wilderness from the air, and the commanding voice of actor Leo McKern tells us, this is a land empty of its Aborigines. Emptied, we learn watching the film, by a horrific story of bloody conflict on the Tasmanian colonial frontier. The Last Tasmanian was successful in its aim to shock white audiences, genocide, how capitalism annihilated the entire race of the Tasmanian Aborigines, announced the Workers' News. Our own awful Holocaust, declared the Sun newspaper. It was as if Australian audiences were learning about Tasmanian colonial history again for the first time. And in a sense they were, at least a history framed within a revisionist, radical, anti-colonial framework. Within this project, Truganini was, I think, reinvented as an Australian national icon, a poster girl for the colonial horrors. She has indeed appeared on countless posters, on a postage stamp, has been the subject of numerous books and poems. She has a suburb here in Melbourne named after her. The hit song Truganini by Midnight Oil questions the very point of Australia's colonisation. The idea of extinction, based as it is upon long obsolete notions of blood and race, has slowly been expunged, but its legacy continues. For while Australians like Henry Reynolds have argued convincingly, Tasmania's frontier was in fact no more violent than the other colonial frontiers of Australia, no more disastrous than for Aboriginal people. The idea of extinction, I think, has long made it seem so, long made it seem a case for genocide, as some have argued, the bloodiest and, as we've seen recently, most controversial of Australia's frontiers. At the end of J.M. Coetzee's novel Elizabeth Costello, the protagonist of that name waits in purgatory, unable to leave until she can make a statement of faith to a panel of judges. She's a writer, she argues. She cannot afford to believe in anything. What of the Tasmanians, she's asked. I've always found them decent people, she responds. I mean the old Tasmanians, she's told, the ones that were exterminated. Is this finally what lies behind this trial? Asks Costello to herself. The question of historical guilt. The idea of that extinction has made Tasmania, in this case, as we've seen, a kind of popular shorthand for white Australian guilt. This was not Coetzee's intention. But I think in a wider, more popular context, Tasmania has become a kind of offshore historical dumping ground. It's the added convenience of being removed from us, a place that's so unlike us, a place not really part of us at all, our own little Gothic repository, in the words of Jim Davidson. Or to paraphrase Tasmanian writer Martin Flanagan, by accepting that Tasmanians exterminated their Aborigines, the rest of Australia can heap its collective guilt upon the island state, secure in the knowledge that they at least weren't as bad as that. It's been useful then, Tasmania, in shaping a cleaner, whiter, contemporary Australian identity. But let's look now at another story of identity, and that of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people themselves. And returning to the film The Last Tasmanian, which appeared at such a pivotal point in the construction of both a contemporary white Australian identity and a contemporary Tasmanian Aboriginal identities. The film not only reiterated that older story of extinction, it actually featured contemporary Aboriginal people. They're filmed at the opening scattering the remains of Truganini in the sea at Dontricastow Channel, as she had always wished. We see them plucking mutton birds on the islands of the Bass Strait. But they're never actually acknowledged as being Aboriginal. In fact, the only time they speak just about is to deny their Aboriginality. A radical self-determinist movement had only just found its momentum at this time, and it was experiencing internal friction and resistance, particularly to the word Aboriginal. And rather than explore these tensions and transitions, the film just used them to bolster a story of extinction. Racist. This film denies Tasmanian Aboriginal people their land rights, proclaimed banners that were pasted over posters of the film in Melbourne, Sydney and Hobart, where protests were staged at cinemas. Historian Lyndall Ryan was researching her PhD when this furor broke out, and her subsequent 1981 book, The Aboriginal Tasmanian, was the first history to declare forthrightly the Tasmanian Aborigines, I quote, have survived. The message slowly filtered through the academic and wider popular communities. When I met Tasmanian Aboriginal elder Jim Everett properly for the first time in 2002, I spoke to him about this word, survival. It is, he told me, no longer a very useful word. During the first wave of radical self-determinism, when he and his community were fighting to be recognised as being alive, the idea of survival had meaning, but now with the success of their wider recognition, it just suggests a kind of coping when a people defined merely by political struggle, when he feels that their culture and people are so much richer than that. Greg Learman writes, the politics of survival are not our culture. They are the measure of the days we live in. Our true culture is where we stand, on our land. Nonetheless, as Jim also explained, politics is still creating so many internal fractures within the Aboriginal community in Tasmania. The Commonwealth Government currently recognises, he told me, 27 Aboriginal groups in Tasmania, named Aboriginal groups. Tasmania's state government, however, in an agreement with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, or TAC, which has still Michael Mansell at its helm, acknowledges only 13 of those communities as legitimate. The others, they say, are not Aboriginal. In 1996, when members of these so-called illegitimate groups were elected to the former government representative body, ATSIC, the TAC disputed their authority, which led in 1998 to a federal court decision. Justice Merkel referred the decision back to the community, saying he couldn't say who was an Aboriginal in Tasmania. Identity was, he said, a social rather than a genetic construct. Nonetheless, in 2002, Tasmania became the first place to trial an ATSIC electoral roll. You had to be on the roll to vote. The Independent Indigenous Advisory Committee then suggested that all those on the roll be DNA tested to prove who was a Tasmanian Aboriginal person. Genetic samples were taken and sent to the University of Arizona, but the process was stopped due to community outrage, likened, they said, to the colonial era theft of human Aboriginal remains. An interesting parallel. Tasmanian human remains were taken in the colonial era because their extinction was assumed. In 2002, they were being collected to determine who was alive, so to speak. There may be some contradiction in such an exclusive aim. in using DNA in this context. Human genes do determine our differences, our individualisms, but they also confirm humanity's overwhelming biological similarity. Richard Dawkins, in The Ancestor's Tale, reflects that the findings of the Human Genome Project make it certain all humans share one ancestor, one common ancestor, an Eve. How far back in time do we have to go, asks Dawkins, to find the most recent human common ancestor, the last Eve, as he calls her, a good name for an atheist. Dawkins models an answer with Tasmanian geography. When rising seas at the end of the Pleistocene, the last ice age, isolated the Tasmanians, they became, Dawkins supposes, the first group of humans who have come out of Africa to be geographically removed from what was previously a shared global gene pool. The last Tasmanian generation, or more symbolically, the last Tasmanian mother, to bridge the separated populations, encompassed the genes of all humanity. She is our most recent common ancestor, our last Eve. What an interesting model. Does this make us all Tasmanian Aborigines? Or does it make, by the same reason, none of us, or no one, a Tasmanian Aborigine? Such rhetorical questions, in a way, then make us then ask another question: when did there actually begin to be a Tasmania? At the end of the Pleistocene in 1856? We can't begin to answer these questions without beginning to map our DNA to history, to land, to politics, to culture, to society. Justice Merkel seems to have been right. Why then are Aboriginal people using such problematic and aggressive forms of self-determinism in Tasmania? The answer to conclude is a messy detritus of colonialism. It's left Aboriginal identity linked inextricably to biology and essentialism for reasons of politics and money. Like other Aboriginal communities, Tasmanian Aborigines also face serious issues to do with housing, education, health. Who has the right to access these resources does create competitive tensions. The loud, heart-thumping remorse of white Australia has not, I think, helped. Even when cloaked in an anti-colonial rhetoric in the late 20th century, much of this remorse was arguably more to do with reconstructing a white national identity than it was with the actual and real problems of Tasmanian Aboriginal people. The otherness and distance of Tasmania's geography and landscape made it a convenient place to deposit the worst of our colonial history. But this idea, based as it was upon recycled 19th century nostalgia for an extinct race, has at times seriously thwarted the contemporary community's efforts to gain recognition of their needs and rights. To end more positively, these needs and rights, political struggles, internal and external, are a real part of the Tasmanian story, but they do not, as Lehman reminded us, determine their deeper sense of identity. Their culture is celebrated in language, traditions, memories, crafts, contemporary art, photography. Think of the photographs of Ricky Maynard, which many people have been talking to me about. Creative and academic writing. In short, their culture is celebrated in a myriad of expressions that all ultimately find their inspiration in their land, in what is, let us remember, their island. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebe, for a paper that opened some new themes and I think brought together some of the ideas that have been bubbling through this morning's talks, and certainly the way in which the past and the events of the past, the messiness of colonialism rises at certain political moments and is remade in particular ways. Now, because all of the speakers have said so much in such a succinct way, which was the intention, we've actually got quite a bit of time now for questions, for comments, but and to reflect on the ideas that have been aired this morning. So I am going to throw the questions open to the floor. If you are going to ask a question, I would like you to stand and identify yourself, and you can direct a question to the panel or to particular speakers. But because I'm the chair, I'm going to ask the first question to the panel, really just to open up discussion and reflect upon the ways in which history, the past, ideas, institutions change over time. And so I wanted to ask everyone on the panel, this is a group question with I think it can have many, many answers. I suppose I was struck when Jim was talking about Trollope in the 1870s travelling around Australia, and I thought, well, look, if there was time travel and he came back today and did, from the perspective of really, we finished the first decade of the 21st century. I suppose my question is, what might there be about contemporary Australia that both, might astound him, but in some ways might not be such a change? I know that's a tricky question, but it was really trying to bring together ideas of change over time. So I wondered if any of the panel...
Well,
so let's start with Jim. Okay.
Well, I think in his case, because he'd already experienced colonial societies, and for example, when he went to South Africa, he drew exactly the opposite conclusion as he did about Australia. And he said that South Africa is a country of black men. It was so, it is so, and it always shall be so. And so then he put a defensive position on the white. So he was very, very flexible. So I think he would actually respond with alacrity to what he saw and try and work out, what had happened. That doesn't particularly help us, but it does nevertheless explain how a really good observer is really running a number of lines simultaneously and shifts weights according to what they find, and that they come and change their responses according to the new patterns, which seem to be bouncing against which they hadn't anticipated.
Well, I'm not sure what Trollope would make of it, but it seems to me as if there is a sense in which Australia, it was hoped that federation would make Australia more of like one country, and it would bring the different colonies closer together. That did seem to be happening during the great sort of middle brow period of the mid-20th century, but I'm not sure that it's continued. It seems to me, especially when I come to Melbourne, that I'm coming almost to another country from Sydney, and I know perfectly well that when I send emails to my sister who lives in North Queensland still, that I'm consciously translating them into values that she understands and still holds dearly, which in my view are values which were strong in Australia in the 1960s. And as for Western Australia, it seems to me that as I don't know why it is, but the differences between the colonies are now greater and stronger than they were 50 years ago.
I don't know whether I can answer it, but since I can't be seen as a coward beside a Sydney-sider, I think he would be surprised at the high standard of living. Yeah. I would think that 50% of Australians today have a higher standard of living than the typical member of the House of Commons in the 1870s. I think he would be disappointed being a writer, the challenge to the printed word and the printing press. But I think he would also be possibly surprised that whereas in the 1870s and early 1880s, there was great talk of the colonies eventually slipping away just as the North American colonies had slipped away. I'm not sure Jim would know better than I. I think he might be surprised to see that there's still a working relationship with Britain.
And I am too.
I'm not quite sure what the question was. Are we still focusing on what Trollope would have said?
Well,
or?
I suppose really it's was a question that used Trollope as a way of thinking, what are some of those big differences? Or are there differences? What would surprise an observer in the 1870s?
Well, I don't know if I can add anything else. I suppose it depends on where they've come from. I mean, I think what's so interesting now is how much we are like so much of the world through you know, the shrinking world. And, you know, if they truly had come from the 1870s, I think, as Geoffrey said, the biggest surprise would be the comfort and the ease and how so much we take for granted and so much we criticise for good reason is something I think that would be the overwhelming surprise for someone from the 19th century. What a lovely place to be.
Well, maybe we can throw it open to our audience. Can I see? We've got a question here, yep. And we do have a microphone.
My name's Tony Ward. I've written a bit on national identity and the sporting crowds that Jeff Laney referred to as getting out of control here. I've got firstly a comment and secondly a question. The comment is some scepticism about the idea that Australians are particularly concerned about national identity. We don't have anything like the Tea Party here in Australia, which is based on a very specific reading, a very specific idea of American identity, and which was evident by the very selective reading of the US Constitution that the Tea Party put in at the recent opening of Congress, leaving out various amendments because we don't need to include them. Well, that means you have a very selective reading. I guess the question I've got comes out some of the things that Beverly Kingston was saying about her background with Scots, Irish, English inheritance, and it's the Scottish one that people particularly picked. It seems to me that we should ask the question, why are we asking ourselves about national identity? Because over time, sometimes we ask about it, other times we don't worry too much about it, we just get on with doing things. In the French literature, as I understand it, the construction of a national identity in the late 19th century, the word that was used the most to try and establish an identity was the word threat. It didn't have much to do with positives. It was very much that this was a response to what people saw as things going wrong. And I think the Tea Party in the US is very much along those lines. So I guess my question for the panel is, yes, we're looking at various aspects of our history that we want to put into a story, but why are we particularly asking those questions at the moment? And what is it about the historical past that we want to draw on to answer those questions?
I'll have a go.
All right. You have a go?
I think there are probably two reasons for that. One, the one I already hinted at, and that is that owing to the historical evolution of Australia, there has never been a decisive moment. And for example, some people still mistakenly believe that we were independent in 1901, whereas in fact the Governor-General was acting as the British High Commissioner, that's to say the ambassador, and writing a report once a week on what His Majesty's Australian ministers were up to. So we were anything but independent in 1901. Some people would in fact argue that it wasn't until 1986, I think it was, when the last acts were passed which enabled, which rather freed the state governments from actually applying to the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office in order to get ratification for the appointment of state governors. that perhaps was the last effective link to be broken. So that, in other words, I think that's part of the answer, that because we haven't had at any moment a really decisive moment at which you could say Australia became an independent country, that this has been a worry, because clearly we are different and we are an independent country. So that I think that's the price we pay, this constant cogitating with lapses into indifference. And also because if we don't, we just then become a lifestyle. And that's very nice, but it's somehow or other leaves things missing. Then combined with this is the fact of the great globalisation and the greater internationalisation of the last 10, 20 years, so that we really don't know quite now whether we need an identity. And yet somehow something tells us, because the world is still organised according to the nation-state principle, we do. So that there's a lot of confusion, I think, coming from both things.
Could I say a bit? I'd do a different gloss on it. I'd say that Australians are embarrassed about being patriotic in an American sense. We are still insecure for all the reasons Jim has outlined about our relationship with Britain, and we're also insecure because of our relationship with America, and we have this sort of constant insecurity about our place in the world, because of our dependence on great and powerful friends, always. But we are also deeply competitive. And not only, I mean, it comes out very clearly in the sporting stuff, but it comes out in every other way. And it's been a standing joke, hasn't it, that Australians ask visitors, "What do you think? What do you think?" Even before they get off the plane. We are deeply competitive with the rest of the world about everything, but particularly about the things we think we do well, like sport and food and coffee and whatever. And so it's not a question of national identity at all. It's all of these things all sort of working together all the time.
No, the good points have been made.
I was thinking of this ad. I don't know if people remember it. I can't quite remember whether it was in the 80s or the 90s. But there was trying to say to people, you know, how many of you can name Australia's first Prime Minister? I don't know if you remember this ad. You know, there was no war that created this nation. And I remember a lot of people, when I was at university studying then, pausing and saying, "What do you mean there wasn't a war?" You know, and this is the Henry Reynolds point, that there should be more national commemorative moments, that there were many wars in this nation to create it. And this created a very interesting discussion. And I do think then saying that there was wars is also problematic, you know. I mean, it's not many times they were called wars. It was, in Tasmania, it was called the Black War while it was happening. And I don't know if it's a particularly useful or helpful way to remember. But I do think it does have to do with how we like to voice or shape ourselves. As Beverly was saying, there's a kind of embarrassment. I don't think there always is. I think there are moments when people are quite violent about who is Australian and who isn't. But when I went to Las Vegas, they had turned the original walkway into a roof that had the world's biggest visual display with songs of I Love America and the landscape. And every single person there who was on holiday, just a tourist, had their hand on their heart. And it meant something to them. And I actually chastised it and said, well, this is awful. And someone said, are you Canadian? You know, there was this sense, and it's because they are a country under threat and at war. And I think we always have this sense that we're not really in the centre of that. You know, we are at a periphery of some kind. And so we do boast it at moments of sporting achievement and culture and arts and coffee. But I think when it comes to those issues, we're always, you know, one of the allies. We're with them. We're not again them, but we're not, we're not. And it has to do with a longer history, but yeah, I think I just wanted to add that as a comment more than a...
Okay, I've got one comment here. Question?
Seamus McManus, and I've never written a book or had an idea, but I was just wondering about this business of colonialism, because I don't think it ever departs, does it? I mean, I saw on TV where the Queen was in Ireland the other day, and I didn't know why she was there. Probably she was there for the takeover or something, you know. But when we come out here to look at things, and don't forget it's only a bit over a year which Mr. Rudd was decapitated, and then Twiggy was dancing around with Gina Reinhardt on the back of a truck. And at the time, he was number 157, wealthiest man in the world. And since then, Gina's income has doubled to 11 billion. But what I want to ask you is this about colonialism. And I'm probably looking at you, Geoffrey, as much as anything. But, isn't it very, very good of Twiggy Forrest that he's putting aside a few $1 million to help those Aboriginal people that need all the help, you know? So what have you got to say about colonialism? Has it really disappeared?
I mean, I was most interested in what you said, but I'm not quite sure whether there's a question.
I mean, I think that actually all of our speakers in their talk indicated how colonialism, the way in which Australia was settled, the ties with Britain, ideas about imperialism, certainly have shaped the 19th century, the 20th century Australia's relations. I mean, I think in a sense, it's a big ask to respond in a couple of minutes to the question about is colonialism, has it passed? Because I think if you had a yes or a no, you'd probably have to say no. But Beverly, do you want to...
I was just going to say, if you translate colonialism into capitalism, which is what it was largely in the 19th century, it is still alive and well.
Most certainly.
I was thinking of, has it ended? I think, again, I was mentioning Jim Everett in my paper, and last year I helped Kate teach a course which was called Post-Colonial History, and he came as a speaker. And one of the things he wanted to say was that he knew that the term post-colonial was related to a set of ideas and theories, but he still had the idea it was problematic. He didn't see that there was anything post about it. And he wanted to say that he was living, there was a continuity in his understanding of experience. And he said that generously, but he said that he didn't think there was... He knew that, strictly speaking, there was a colonial period and a period that was so-called ended, but he didn't feel that he was able to say that he was living free of the, as I put it earlier, the detritus of colonialism. It's still a heavy yoke to carry.
There was a time, I think, when we in Australia felt totally different from South Africa, but I think what has become apparent with the Aboriginal revival is that there has been some parallelism between the experience of South Africa and the experience of Australia, precisely in this point. In the South African case, because there were so many blacks, it was obviously a white domination. What happened here was that, in the way that we've discussed passingly this morning, the whites gradually and imperceptibly came to run the affairs of this continent. They were de-dominionised. But it's taken a separate process for the Aborigines to become decolonised, and that we still haven't seen the end of.
Okay, got perhaps a question up here.
Jan Elder is my name. I'm interested in the issue that we seem to be skirting around, is where Aboriginality and where Aborigines and non-Aborigines come together in the issue of identity. And I'm wondering, maybe Rebe might be the person who'd be best to answer this one, where you thought the apology from Kevin Rudd stood. It's clear that it had a great effect on Aboriginal people, so I'm not sure about Tasmanians in particular, but where it stood in that, what you might say, whether it was closer to a kind of a breast-beating guilt, or whether it was more was of the area of a recognition and a clear recognition of the past, and what that has done to incorporate Aboriginality further into our Australian identity, if anything.
I think it's a good question. I don't think I'm any more qualified to answer it than the rest of the panel, or perhaps anyone here, and certainly not better qualified than Aboriginal people. But I would say that it was a very important moment. I think we'd agree. And I think it was the apology I'm referring to, and I think it was a very different tone than what I was very trying to emphatically say was a late 20th century remorse, which I think was cloaked in a kind of very loud anti-colonial rhetoric. It was to do more with voicing a kind of new politics, which I think has been around now for long enough to become perhaps more fine-grained and a little bit more reflective and incorporating of realer and more aware issues to do with Aboriginal history, rather than just saying, I mean, how many times have people have said to me, oh, Tasmanian Aboriginal history, oh, we killed them all, didn't we? No, you know, we did a terrible job there. It was just kind of like a... Whereas now I think with that apology, it was a more across the nation and very well thought out, I thought, moment. And a very important moment as far as I understand for most Aboriginal people. And not a lengthy conversation I've had with anyone in Tasmania about that. But there seemed an emphasis in your question of how do we go in terms of incorporating Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal identities. And in a sense, kind of another word for that used to be reconciliation. And I think, as far as I understand, the conversations, when they come down to real listening, the conversations are always good. What always astounds me is how generous Aboriginal people are when asked to speak. How often and repeatedly they have to explain where they're from and their story and who they are. And they do it with such grace and with such generosity amongst people who are always sort of jaw-dropping. This is the first time I've met an Aboriginal, but this is amazing. And I think it just is a matter of continually opening doors and opportunities and hearts and minds to that conversation. And I think that apology was a really good moment in which that started to happen in a more real way. And I was just so thankful that it happened. Yeah.
We've got a question here.
Thank you. My name is Owen Tassica. I'm qualified as an engineer and a scientist, and I have practiced around the world in both of those disciplines. And my early life began here in Melbourne. I grew up in Ivanhoe, and I pushed my bicycle all the way from Ivanhoe through Carlton, down Grattan Street, and into these great gates every morning for many years. And with permission, Ms. Chairperson, Ms. Chairperson, if there is anybody here who can beat my record of riding their bicycle further than from Ivanhoe to these great gates out here, please identify yourself, let me know, and we'll have a cup of coffee and we'll reminisce about those good old days when we sat through boring lectures in wet trousers because it rained on the way.
Thank you.
Yes, now there is a question. And the question is that several of our speakers have alluded to the year 1901. Now, although a group of prominent gentlemen in high hats, black hats, trundled up from Spring Street in a very early electric tram, and there was a great ceremony just a mile or two up the road. I used mile deliberately. Yes, several of our speakers on the panel have alluded to that important event and have implied some criticism. Did that really create nationalism from the cane fields of Queensland to the mining companies in far western Australia? And I think the rhetorical question was didn't really create too much in the way of a strong nationalist feeling. Can we go on, and now this is the question, can we go on a few years to 1915, to the ill-fated campaign in Turkey, when the casualty lists gradually became known and were printed across the newspapers all the way across Australia, and there was collective grief at the loss of life and the suffering which was being incurred by all parties in 1915 in southern Turkey. Okay, now, can any of our speakers please comment on whether that has had or is having an effect on our view of nationalism, especially amongst the younger generation?
I actually, thank you for your question, because I was waiting for Gallipoli to come up in the questioning actually, and I'm quite interested. It took quite a while for us to get to 1915. I do want to throw that to the panel, and I suppose that when Jeffrey was talking about red, white and blue nationalism, in some ways that's a precursor to some of the expressions of nationhood around the First World War. But I'll throw it to you, Jeffrey. Can I do that?
My view is that the creation of the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901 was partly due to a nationalist movement, although there was also an imperial sentiment at work. It suited Australia to have stronger defences, and that could only happen with a new relationship with Britain. I think the new Commonwealth increased nationalism to some degree, so it was both cause and effect. My view is that Gallipoli, for a time, accelerated or deepened a strong strand of Australian nationalism, and my view, I could be wrong, is that the early generations of Australians, once they'd become respectable, were ashamed of the convict ancestry. Now, of course, they rejoice in it if their family tree is lucky enough, but they saw Gallipoli as in some way the erasing of what they saw as the convict shame. But I think Gallipoli really set in motion two different streams of nationalism. I think the right-wing stream of nationalism, if that's the fair label, grew as a result of Gallipoli, but I think the left-wing stream of nationalism was soon in serious trouble, and the Labor Party split, and large sections of the Irish in Australia or the people of Irish descent in Australia, weren't sure to do. And by the end of the war, I think a considerable majority of Labor Party politicians in Australia wished that the war was over and said so openly. And in fact, there was a strong movement at that time in the Labor Party to set up a Soviet-type army with no officers. So the war had a splitting effect, in my view, on Australian nationalism. One stream of nationalism jumping forward and taking over the war memorials and taking defence, I think, more seriously in the 20s and 30s. The other stream of nationalism disillusioned with the war, not sure whether Australia should have taken part in it, not sure whether Australia should defend itself in the 1920s and 1930s adequately. I think that's one of the reasons why many people, irrespective of their politics, see Curtin as a great Prime Minister, a man who in the First World War was close to a pacifist, but then persuaded his party that you had, in the end, to defend this nation when they came to power. So that's my own reading of the two events you described. Good luck with your cycling.
I mean, I suppose I just wanted to add on to that. If we think about the legacy of history, and certainly the legacy of Gallipoli in the First World War, been a lot of discussion about Anzac Day. Certainly one of the phenomena we've seen in the late 20th century into the early 21st century has been the revival or the shift in the way in which Anzac Day is commemorated. And I think as we have the centenary of Gallipoli approaching, that puts various questions, issues, events very firmly in the public eye about Australian identity and the nation, relation to war and so on. Patrick has a question here.
My name is Patrick McCarthy, and I want to ask an exceedingly naive question to make everybody else feel confident to ask a question behind me. And that is, when did Australians begin to call themselves Australians? Did they do it before 1901, or were you, before 1901 and Federation, were you a Queenslander, a Victorian, a South Australian, a New South Welshman, a Tasmanian, not to forget them? And when did you actually have a sense that you were Australian and you weren't simply a Victorian?
Well. I'm not absolutely sure of the answer to that. I'm pretty sure that people did call themselves Australians before 1900, though the sense in which they did was not in a kind of a political sense. It was really, they were saying they were Australian as opposed to British. It was when they were put down for being colonial that they became sort of aggressively Australian about it. But I'd have to go back and look at the dictionaries and the texts.
Well, we know that in 1888, Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales, decided that New South Wales should be called Australia, which is a clue to the power of those two competing images, the local and the national. I would think, myself, I would think that most Australians in 1890 saw themselves, except on rare occasions, as Victorians or Queens. I would think that most Australians would. There may be occasions.
Yeah, it wasn't a positive description. It was a reactive description.
And we know that Australian rules at that time were still called Victorian rules.
We did have an Australian cricket team from the 1880s.
That's right.
I think also it's a question of when Australians were abroad, they were Australian, and very struck by the fact that that the biggest foreign community on the Johannesburg goldfields, the Rand, in the 1890s was in fact Australian, and they identified themselves as Australia. And in a procession to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, which was basically poking their tongue out at the Boer Republican government, there was a float with the early coat of arms of Australia, and so that it's a very uneven progression. I think also W.C. Wentworth started a paper called The Australian, didn't he? Yeah, it starts very unevenly. But by the same token, you'll get Barry Humphries, of course, describing himself as a Victorian. From perversity and obviously picking up in both meanings. But I think a lot of Australians certainly up to the Second World War, particularly expatriates, still thought of themselves. I know Sir Kenneth Weir, who was a Vice-Chancellor at Oxford and who came from this university originally, would still always describe himself as a Victorian first and as an Australian second. So that it's been a long process.
And I think the word, if I could just, the word that was used more frequently than Australia at one time was Australasia.
Yes.
With its New Zealand
Yes.
edition. And the National Bank was called the National Bank of Australasia. The name was used again and again, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that went after New Zealand dropped out.
Yes.
Yes, and I suppose also the way in which Australia gets coupled with imperial. If you think first AIF, second AIF, in ways that it can be very hard. I've always found talking about Australia to students in other countries outside Australia, sometimes talking about that way in which identity can be, well, Victorian or New South Wales, Australian and British can be a very complicated, quite hard to explain sense of identity. Now look, we've got time because I have to wind up very, very soon. There is someone up here who's got a hand up. Very short question, if you can, please.
I'm also a school teacher, and I remember being at the airport some years ago, and there was a young Australian soldier standing there with a slouch hat, and a child said to her mum, "Who's that?" And mum said, "That's the Australian Army." And I think of Gallipoli in that sense that for the first time, apart from the South African War, Australians came together and there was a sense of belonging and identity was formed out of that. And I see that in the current generation of secondary students today. While my generation would say in the 1940s that, and I did say, the only foreign accent I ever heard in the 1940s was Scottish. Today I shut my eyes irrespective of where the child has come from, and I listen for two things. One's the accent and the other are the attitudes of that child. And that's where you see the Australian identity today, irrespective of where the child has come from. So, questions of identity. Thank you.
Any comments on that? No, I think actually that's a very nice way to close, because as you were speaking, I was remembering in my childhood the way in which you could tell an Adelaide accent, and maybe you still can very clearly, or Adelaide accent. You know, the way in which language has changed, accents have changed really very, very quickly, and so we have now a standard Australian voice, or maybe we don't, maybe we have many standards. You know, that sort of idea of standard English or standard Australian. I'd like to thank you all as an audience. I think it's been a terrific morning, and I'd also very, very much like to thank our wonderful panel who's taken us from the 19th century, 20th century into the 21st, and has raised, we've had many, many ideas put on the table. So thank you to Jim, Beverly, Jeffrey and Reby. And I'd also like to acknowledge the wonderful work of Patrick McCaughey as the Director of the Festival of Ideas, and Jaisal Shaw as the Deputy Director of the festival, bringing speakers, audience together. Will remind you that at 1:30, do come back and hear a keynote lecture by Professor Linda Colley, continuing on our discussion of ideas about history, identity, nation-making, nationhood. And this afternoon at 3 o'clock, we have a second panel looking at Australian history and influences of ideas, this time from the 20th century going forward. So I'd like to welcome you all back and thank you for being with us this morning.